Thanks so much for coming to our first Pastors Develop for 2026. We're really excited about the year. We've got a team of guys who are working towards certain goals and things that we want to achieve over the duration of the year. And maybe I'll announce some of that stuff at the end of our session. But thank you so much for prioritising the time, for physically being here. Also, just thought it'd be cool to flag some people who have sent apologies and said they're going to watch either online or chime in and watch it. We're going to make the material available after the event. That's our plan as well, to make a database of material that people can watch after this as well. So I'll just read them out quickly here. Jim and Betty Saru, they've had a death in the family. So maybe at the end we can pray for them. They couldn't be here. They send their apologies and their prayers for us. Wayne Alex, who's the new pastor at Narellan, he's sending his apologies. He's down at a conference in Adelaide. But again, really keen to touch base with us all and keen to touch in with the material after this as well. We have Dave Watkins online watching. There might be a few other people who jump in as well. He's up in Hunters Hill. And Steve Wood said he would chime in online as well at some point today. So there are people who have wished the best for what we're doing here and are encouraged by what we're trying to do and would join us either digitally here if they could, but they can't be here. We're just super conscious of time. We're going to try and do 2 sessions and really finish around 12. Also, I'll say this at the end as well to remind you, but we're going to go to lunch afterwards quickly. Again, you're welcome to come and join us if you want to hang out for a bit, but you're welcome to go home. It's up to you. I'm going to introduce our speaker, Ian. I've known Ian for many, many years. I think the first year I met Ian was in 2013, if I remember correctly. It might have been a bit earlier than that, actually.
Around the 12,
13. And so just in terms of context, Ian taught me theology at Sydney Missionary and Bible College. So thank you so much for coming and sharing with us.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Huge question. I'm just going to throw it on you. What have you been doing for the last 14 years of your life?
Last 14 years, so just in terms of work, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah. So I've been teaching at Sydney Missionary and Bible College, mostly teaching theology, a bit of church history as well, writing a bunch of books as well.
Yeah, cool. You're a bit of a specialist on, the technical word is ecclesiology. Yeah? Well, you thought a lot about it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what you taught me.
Yeah.
So really briefly, again, just throwing this on you, I'm sorry, mate, you can think on your feet, that's good. We're going to be speaking about what does it mean to be congregational. Can you give me a 2-sentence summary of some of the things you're going to be sharing on today, even though it's a little bit broader as well?
Yeah.
So
Congregationalists have a really rich, theological and ecclesiological history. So we're going to think about some of the ways in which our founding fathers have thought about matters of ecclesiology. They've thought pretty deeply about that, and in particular, think about issues of what does it mean to be an independent church, but also an interdependent church.
It's good language. Language we're trying to capture in our denom, in our fellowship. Some things are coming up that are shifting for you a little bit. Again, don't want to get all personal, but could you share really quickly and briefly on that?
So we've lived for a number of years over in the US before coming to Australia, and we're in the process of transitioning back over there again. So care for an ageing, widowed mother-in-law. So we'll be close to her.
Yep.
Still be involved with SMBC, but on a much more part-time basis.
Sweet. And obviously today there'll be a lot of time to ask questions and share reflections. There'll be people online potentially doing it as well, so we'll have to navigate that. Really excited that you're here and sharing with us. I'm going to pray really quickly and then we can jump in, if that's appropriate. Let's do that. Lord, thank you so much for the fellowship of Cong churches. Thank you for the amazing things you're doing in us together as a group of like-minded churches, preaching and proclaiming the gospel, but also what you're doing at a local level in the churches as well. Thank you so much for Ian. Thank you for his gifting. Thank you for the things you've shown him over many years of study and reflection. And thank you for what he's going to share for us today. Pray that we have ears to hear and hearts to receive. Amen. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, Tim, and Greetings to everyone online as well. Michael, do they have access to the notes online? Excellent. So for folks in person online, you should hopefully have access to the handout. So Tim has asked me to just present some thoughts today and facilitate some discussion on what does it mean to be congregational, history and distinctives. So I've got some orienting questions just to set us up this morning, and hopefully by the end of our time together we'll have had the opportunity to wrestle with some of these questions. How might those who've gone before us influence, shape, challenge the way congregational churches relate to one another, the way congregational churches display their congregational autonomy, the way congregational churches display their congregational interdependence, and lastly, the way pastors of congregational churches think about their vocations. So in this first 45-minute spot, I wanted to spend some time thinking about some historical distinctives and in particular some lessons from our congregational founding fathers. Now I'm going to be citing a few different documents over the next little while. So I realise that all of us here have the Cambridge Platform, Savoy Declaration and Heads of Agreement pretty well memorised by this stage. So this is a little bit redundant what I'm doing here, but just bear with me. So in terms of background, some really brief historical background as to where these documents fit in, when they were written, why they were written. So Cambridge Platform, 1648. 1640s, bit of a golden era when it came to producing confessional and polity documents on both sides of the Atlantic. The Westminster Assembly had produced the Shorter Catechism in 1647, and then the Westminster Confession in 1648. You might be aware that the Westminster Assembly, it wasn't unfriendly to Congregationalists, but it was quite Presbyterian dominated, had very Presbyterian flavour, one of the reasons why it's been adopted as the standard Presbyterian confessional statement. Now, over in Congregational Massachusetts, the fear was that the Westminster Confession might make its way unaltered across the Atlantic and be imposed on Congregational New England. And so in 1646, there was a general synod of congregational churches, and it was called together by the General Court of Massachusetts, and the result was the Cambridge Platform. At first, the focus was just on congregational distinctives like church membership and their take on baptism, but its parameters expanded as they became aware of the expansiveness of the Westminster Assembly's aims. So in many ways, the Cambridge Platform was an explicit congregational response to the Westminster Confession of Faith. What about the Savoy Declaration? Well, if the Cambridge Platform is an American document, the Savoy Declaration is a British one, produced in 1658. And in many ways, it's a British congregational counterpart to the Westminster Confession. In terms of doctrine, it's virtually identical. The only real differences are in terms of ecclesiology. Now, whereas the Cambridge Platform was, as an American document, as I've said, the Savoy was English. The 200 representatives met, led by some pretty famous guys in the history of the church, John Owen, Thomas Goodwin, amongst others. So that's the Savoy Declaration. And then the third document that I'm going to appeal to, reference this morning, is what's known as the Heads of Agreement, produced in 1708, produced in Saybrook, Connecticut, so just a little bit to the south of Massachusetts, produced by a synod of Connecticut Congregational and Presbyterian churches. And their goal, as we'll see, this will come through in the excerpts that I'll be reading for us from the Heads of Agreement, their goal was to encourage interaction, fellowship, across Reformed churches of different ecclesiological persuasions. Mostly Presbyterians and Congregationalists, but they weren't averse to Anglicans getting in on the interchurch fellowship as well. So a really interesting early 18th century effort to reach across denominational divides and see unity expressed there, not just amongst congregational churches, but across a range of different theologically like-minded churches. Okay, so with that as a little bit of background, I want to ask a couple of questions. First, are Congregationalists committed to independence or interdependence? And then secondly, are Congregationalists ecclesiological introverts? And I want to address those questions via some misconceptions that I suspect many of us have heard, maybe some of us have secretly harboured and since repented of, but various misconceptions that mischaracterise Congregationalism. And as we'll see, our founding fathers have wrestled deeply with and about and addressed. So this first misconception surrounding the way in which Congregationalists are committed to independence almost at the expense of interdependence. So we see this misconception embodied in this quote from Robert Raymond, a Presbyterian. He writes, "In light of the biblical evidence on unity, why do Congregationalists put so much emphasis upon, indeed glory in as one of their church distinctives, local church autonomy?" So you can see what he's doing there. He's certainly picking up and emphasising a cherished congregational distinctive, our emphasis on autonomy, on independence, but casting it as a zero-sum game. That if you're committed to independence, you can't at all be in favour of interdependence. No space for interdependence. Now, our forefathers have thought deeply about this one, and they've argued that it's not a zero-sum game. You can have not just one, but both. Indeed, to be a Congregationalist is to be committed to independence and interdependence. To be independent and interconnected, over on page 2. Now, how is this interdependence to be expressed? Well, it's to be expressed with other churches, especially other congregational churches. So when it comes to the independence side of things, the Cambridge platform puts it this way: although churches be distinct and therefore may not be confounded one with another and equal, and therefore have not dominion one over another. So there's very clearly independence affirmed. But they don't stop there. They go on to affirm this: all the churches ought to preserve church communion one with another, because they are all united unto Christ, not only as a mystical, but as a political head, whence is derived a communion suitable thereunto. In other words, our founding fathers were not simply content to say, we have spiritual unity one with another, but we're under no obligation to express that physically. No. This needs to be expressed physically. That's what they mean by as a political head. It needs to be manifested in a tangible way. So independent to be sure, but also interconnected was one of the things that they were wanting to preserve and encourage. Okay, so that's the American take on these things. Savoy Declaration expressing similar things. As all churches and all the members of them are bound to pray continually for the good prosperity of all the churches of Christ in all places, and upon all occasions to further it, so the churches themselves, when planted by the providence of God, so as they may have opportunity and advantage for it, ought to hold communion amongst themselves for their peace, increase of love, and mutual edification. So furthest thing from the stereotype that congregational churches are purely independent. Our forefathers have said, yes, to be sure, independent, but also interdependent, and have done their utmost to enshrine that in this early foundational statement. If you're purely independent at the expense of interdependence, then you are not being congregational in a historic sense. So there's how this expresses itself with other churches, congregational churches, but then also Congregationalists concerned to see that this interdependence cross-denominational lines as well, which is interesting. So I've got some excerpt here from the Heads of Agreement. Remember, this is produced in Connecticut, a sort of joint document from Congregationalists and Presbyterians, but also including Reformed-leaning Anglicans as well. So this is how they put it. Of communion of churches, we agree that particular churches ought not to walk so distinct and separate from each other as not to have care and tenderness towards one another. But their pastors ought to have frequent meetings together, that by mutual advice, support, encouragement, and brotherly intercourse, they may strengthen the hearts and hands of each other in the ways of the Lord. 2, that none of our particular churches shall be subordinate to one another. 3, that known members of particular churches may have occasional communion with one another in the ordinances of the gospel. For example, the word, prayer, sacraments, singing of psalms dispensed according to the mind of Christ. So not just pastors getting together to encourage one another, but welcome members of your respective churches into one another's fellowships. Of a confession of faith, as to what appertains to soundness of judgment in matters of faith, we esteem it sufficient that a church acknowledge the Scriptures to be the Word of God, the perfect and only rule of faith and practice, and own either the doctrinal part of those commonly called the Articles of the Church of England, or the Confession, or catechisms, shorter or larger, compiled by the Assembly at Westminster, or the confession agreed on at the Savoy to be agreeable to the said rule. So, notice emphasis is on the doctrinal component of those confessional statements, Congregational, Presbyterian, Anglican, setting aside our ecclesiological differences at this point, and we're just wanting to see that there is communion amongst members, amongst pastors that's encouraged, interdependence encouraged, really explicitly. Of our duty and deportment towards them that are not in communion with us, we judge it our duty to bear a Christian respect to all Christians, according to their several ranks and stations that are not of our persuasion or communion. 3, that such who appear to have the essential requisites to church communion, we shall willingly receive them in the Lord, not troubling them with disputes about lesser matters being ecclesiological differences at this point. So again, wanting to cherish them as core identity markers, not to be dispensed with cavalierly, but at the same time relegating them to their relative place in the scheme of things, wanting to preserve our doctrinal unity. Okay, so there's a misconception, or the first question at least, that I wanted to explore with us. Are Congregationalists committed to independence or interdependence? And I think the answer we've seen is at least as far as our founding fathers were concerned? The answer is yes. Okay, not one or the other, but both. Far from Raymond's misconception, Congregationalists have always, historically, been committed to preserving both of those truths. Okay, what about a second question? Are Congregationalists ecclesiological introverts? So independent and autonomous that our gaze is focused so inwards that we have no bandwidth for looking outwards. Again, the misconception cast in this way by Louis Berkhoff. Moreover, the theory that each church is independent of every other church fails to express the unity of the Church of Christ has a disintegrating effect and opens the door for all kinds of arbitrariness in church government. Okay, so not a high view of Congregationalism expressed here by Berkhoff, but you get the point. As far as he's concerned, to be a Congregationalist, so committed to independence, can't help but lead to introversion, eccentricity. How have Congregationalists respond? Well, they've thought about this, thought deeply about this, and have actively warded against this susceptibility, this temptation to devolve into introversion, ecclesiological introversion. In fact, as far as our founding fathers are concerned, to be congregational is to be outward-looking, far from the furthest thing from the stereotype. To be outward-looking when it comes to navigating tricky pastoral and theological waters. So hear how the Savoy Declaration puts it. In cases of difficulties, of differences, either in point of doctrine or in administrations, wherein either the churches in general are concerned or any one church in their peace, union and edification, or any member or members of any church are injured in, or by any proceeding in censures not agreeable to truth and order, it is according to the mind of Christ that many churches holding communion together do by their messengers meet in a synod or council to consider and give their advice in or about that matter in difference, to be reported to all the churches concerned. So there's interdependence affirmed. And now here's the independence qualifier. Howbeit, these synods so assembled are not entrusted with any church power, properly so called, or with any jurisdiction over the churches themselves, to exercise any censures, either over any churches or persons, or to impose their determinations on the churches or offices. So, wanting to preserve autonomy, church autonomy, preserve that independence, but surely you'd be foolish not to avail yourselves of the wisdom of theologically, ecclesiologically like-minded congregational churches. Avail yourselves of the wisdom that comes through a synod, whether it's formal or otherwise. And yet that synod is occasional. And it has no binding authority. It can make very strong recommendations, but at the end of the day, in terms of how they're received, that's up to local churches. Cambridge platform, similarly, by way of consultation one with another, when we have occasion to require the judgment and counsel of other churches touching any person or cause wherewith they may be better acquainted than ourselves. So a little more succinctly than the Savoy. So to be congregational is to be outward-looking when it comes to navigating these tricky pastoral or theological waters. Also notice that congregational churches are to be outward-looking when it comes to church planting as well. So again, the furthest thing from introversion. So the Cambridge platform has this to say, and puts it in delightful language. There is also a way of propagation of churches When a church shall grow too numerous, it is a way and fit season to propagate one church out of another by sending forth such of their members as are willing to remove, as bees, when the hive is too full, issue forth by swarms and are gathered into other hives. So the churches of Christ may do the same upon like necessity. So, nice problem to have. Church gets too big. What do? This encouragement to pursue church planting, go and be like a bee. Though there is this caveat. So by all means, an encouragement to church planting, but a caveat as well, and a really interesting caveat. So the Savoy Declaration offers this as a caution against hasty church planting. For the avoiding of differences that may otherwise arise, for the greater solemnity in the celebration of the ordinances of Christ, and the opening away for the larger usefulness of the gifts and graces of the Holy Ghost, saints living in one city or town, or within such distances as they may conveniently assemble for divine worship, ought rather to join in one church for their mutual strengthening and edification than to set up many distinct societies. So, an interesting caution. I think if you were to ask, is there ever would we ever want to put hesitate about church planting? Is church planting ever improper? Our founding fathers, so committed are they to unity, preserving unity, actually would want to just caution setting up churches too close to one another. If there is an opportunity for Christians to be together physically across denominational lines, that's preferable than setting up lots of different churches for the sake of it. So I have some questions for reflection for us. I think I've done enough talking just for the time being. So some questions for reflection. Tim, maybe is it best if we just sort of get into groups at this point? Yeah, maybe with our partner. Some questions. In what ways do you see these encouragements towards congregational independence and interdependence displayed within the FCC, within your own church? And then what areas for growth in association between churches do you see? For example, when it comes to, and this is not meant to be an exhaustive way in which interdependence is manifested in the New Testament, but these are some of the ways in which it's manifested. When it comes to theological and cross-cultural missional reflection in Acts 15, sharing of gospel workers in Acts 18, economic relief in 2 Corinthians 8, missionary support in Philippians 1 and 4, and general spiritual encouragement in 1 Thessalonians 1. It's not meant to be an exhaustive list, but these are some of the ways in which the New Testament urges us to express our to express ourselves as local churches in relationship with other local churches. So maybe, Tim, what do you think? Maybe just with our partner for 4 or 5 minutes. So maybe talk about some of those questions, and then we'll pool our wisdom. We are embodying, exemplifying some of these characteristics that we've seen, these aspirational documents, aspirational hopes that our founding fathers have set forward for us, ways in which we're embodying these, but also ways in which we'd like to embody them more. So over to you. Ways in which independence and interdependence, ways in which you've seen that, you're doing that on a local church level, on an association level. Anything you'd like to share? Mm. 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 So maybe one encouragement is I know you guys have memorised, internalised these polity documents, but can't assume that our congregation members have. So yeah. Yes. Yeah. 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 Mm. Mm. Yeah. Excellent. Oh. Yes. Yes. Thank you. Yes. We'll do. We'll do. Mm.
Here, but it's interesting how he says, he pointed out a potential weakness, or as he saw it, of Congregationalism, which is it opens the door for all kinds of arbitrariness in church governance, right? And I think, I'm not going to mention any churches or anything, but I think we've seen that, like some churches, when they don't do Congregationalism well and don't embrace this aspirational view of what you're saying, or what the Savoy Declaration's saying, they go down a funny path, and you see them become kind of, I don't know how to say this, but theologically kind of weird, and culturally weird, and pastorally weird, and structurally kind of weird. And again, not going to mention any places, but I think it's almost like that critique that Burkhoff raised, which I've heard from other people, there's validity to that when Congregationalism isn't done well, if you know what I mean. But that's not really, maybe that is a strengthening of the case for it as well. If you don't understand it and apply it biblically and thoroughly and well, then it does go down a pretty problematic path, or at least has the potential.
Yeah. Tim was just suggesting that...
Sorry, that's a rant.
That Burkhoff's fear that congregational churches can devolve into eccentricity, it's not a merely sort of academic. There are lived examples of that. So yeah. Mm. Mm.
Ian, we found it very helpful that when the theological position in terms of those groups, other groups in which we can work with, they were all within that broadly reformed confession group as well. And so it's not to sort of say that our doctrinal position is so wide to encompass any doctrinal viewpoint.
Yes.
It actually does have a broad application, but is more narrow within a stream as well.
Yes, it's not accidental or incidental, I think, that the framers of the Savoy were limiting their fellowship to a limited number of denominations. in order to preserve that doctrinal unity. There were a number of other denominations rattling around that they could have included, but they didn't. And that's quite, yes, the omissions are quite, the silences on the landscape there are quite telling. Yes. Thank you.
I was just going to say one other reflection is that's interesting that was at a certain historical point in which the denominational or theological landscape was, sort of set.
Yeah.
And it's what's Congregationalism engaged with and allowed and said more broadly, what is our theological place since that point in time? That's an interesting thing to wrestle with now. Do we go back to that, or do we widen it?
Right. And that's right. And I take it wasn't so much the denominational brand names that were instructive for these guys. It was whether a given Anglican, Presbyterian, Congregational church was doctrinally faithful to its founding principles. So I think that was the litmus test, and I take it that ought to be our litmus test as well, that doctrinal purity, regardless of whatever brand name goes with a given church that we're thinking about associating with. Maybe time for one more, you reckon, Tim? Yeah, James.
The heads of platform and the Savoy Declaration was a part of our heritage when we formed, such that I think it's wonderful going back to these documents, and these are our forefathers historically speaking, but what did we inherit in the late 70s of this interdependence and independence? I think I see some of it. I'm just curious to know how living and active was that for us when we formed, which may or may not have contributed to where we are now, or was it there, much as we have seen expressed by you this morning, and not so much now?
Yes.
I don't know.
Who can answer that one?
That's a bigger question for...
I think for the members of churches, the Savoy Declaration probably wasn't talked about much, but it may have been talked about at higher levels by those who were involved in drawing up the statement of faith. So I think they did draw up a statement of faith that's consistent with the Savoy Declaration, but I don't think I don't recall discussions about the Savoy Declaration when church meetings were held about whether or not we'd join the uniting church. But the discussions certainly were centred on doctrine. Yes, there were issues of church governance and polity that were involved, but the principal things were such as the authority of Scripture and things like that are very high in our statement of faith. They were the things that were discussed. But as I said, I suspect if there was discussions about how this fits with the Savoy Declaration, it would have been at the level above those of us in the pews by those who were charged with drawing these things up. Yeah, I wasn't part of that. Yeah.
James, do you see its sort of lack of presence at the moment? Are there things that you're thinking of when you, particular lived examples you're thinking of when you raise that question?
I think my impression is that we have sought to varying degrees to express the fact that we are independent and interdependent. I just don't know if we've always clearly defined what that should or could look like. And I don't my impression is that we haven't often looked to our historic documents to give us guidance on that.
Tim, what do you reckon? Take a break?
Yeah. Have you finished this part of it? Are you...
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. This would be a natural
great.
break point.
Yeah.
Unless you want to keep the discussion going a little longer, up to you.
I feel like maybe now's the time that we can chat informally around.
Yeah.
Whatever. So yeah, how about we take 10? And so according to my watch, that's 11:02. We'll be back here. That's cool with you? Yeah. Great. Thanks, Ian.
So we've just looked at some historical distinctives, some lessons from our Congregationalist founding fathers, plural. What I want to do in the next 45 minutes is look at some lessons from an evangelical founding father, singular. So a couple of years ago, I had the chance to do a deep dive into a guy you've probably heard of, George Whitefield. And the outcome was this book, Whitefield on the Christian Life, which is in the, you may have seen the series, it's in the Theologians on the Christian Life series. So this is about number, 18 or 19 in that series. As we'll see, Whitefield was quite the entrepreneur. So in the spirit of Whitefield, I've got some of these to flog if you're interested in getting your hands on one afterwards. One of the things I got to think about was Whitefield's legacy, and especially his legacy for us as evangelicals. So I'm broadening the aperture here from Congregationalism to evangelicalism. And what I think we'll see is that in many ways, we owe a great deal to George Whitefield, for better and for worse, when it comes to how we think about our vocations as pastors and how we think about church, doing church. So what I want to do is just read to you just an excerpt from the final chapter of this book where I got to think about his legacy for us as evangelicals. And so this is leading towards just a reflection question at the very end, which is, in what ways do we see these impulses replicated in contemporary evangelical practice within the FCC, within your own immediate pastoral setting? So this is where this is heading. This is a lightly edited draft of a section from that final chapter. So this will take about 20-25 minutes for me to read through, and then we'll have the chance to reflect. So George Whitefield's legacy: evangelical, pragmatic entrepreneurialism embodied. Capturing the essence of George Whitefield's legacy in the 19th century American poet John Greenleaf Whittier's estimation was a simple enough matter. In the title of his homage to the celebrated British itinerant, he was succinctly the preacher, a homeless pilgrim with dubious name, blown about on the winds of fame. Many of Whitefield's contemporaries, not to mention generations of biographers, have followed suit in focusing on his reputation as a wayfaring evangelist. Artists commissioned to paint his portrait, including John Wollaston in 1742 and John Greenwood in 1768, depicted him as a theatrical preacher. The following century, Eyre Crow's 1865 painting entitled Whitefield Preaching in the Moorfields provided the visual template not only for Robert Tate Mackenzie's now removed sculpture at the University of Pennsylvania. Whitefield was cancelled in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. So his statue came down because of his involvement with slavery. But also the logo adopted by the Banner of Truth Trust. So if you own any Banner books at home, the symbol on the spine of the preacher, that's Whitefield preaching, and it comes from one of these paintings, this 1865 painting. After all, given his theological commitments, who better than Whitefield to serve as the visual ambassador for this publishing house's brand of revival-oriented experiential Calvinism? While Whittier's poem celebrated Whitefield as an evangelist on the errands of angels sent, the Quaker abolitionists' tribute did not shy away from acknowledging that his legacy was complicated by his unrepentant entanglements with slavery. Akin to generations of God's people before him, he cast Whitefield as a flawed ambassador of a flawless gospel. He erred, shall we count his gifts as naught? Was the work of God in him unwrought? Was the Hebrew temple less fair and good that Solomon bowed to gods of wood? So in light and shadow the preacher went, God's erring and human instrument. He also drew attention to Whitfield's inauspicious final resting place under the church of Federal Street in Newburyport, Massachusetts, a Presbyterian congregation he had helped establish a quarter of a century earlier. For one who achieved such unparalleled celebrity status during his lifetime, Whittier felt the understated location, walled about by its basement stones, was somehow unbefitting. Not that Whitfield himself would likely have complained. In fact, as one who routinely declared, "Let the name of Whitfield perish, but Christ be glorified," one suspects he might well have approved of his crypt's humble surroundings, one that today sits at the bottom of a rickety set of wooden stairs and adjacent to the Old South Church's furnace, an assorted collection of snow shovels and rakes. If you want to see photos, I'm sure Tim has some on his camera roll. Tim and I visited Old South Church. When was that, Tim? Like about 10 years ago? 2017. Yep. So Tim will tell you all about it. But if Whitfield's burial place was, in the words of Phyllis Wheatley's 1770 eulogy, a tomb obscurely placed, it was not nearly remote or hidden enough to deter generations of admirers from making the pilgrimage to Newburyport to gaze upon his earthly remains, and in some cases even extract souvenirs. One notable instance occurred in September 1775 when an entourage of American Revolutionary soldiers, including the yet-to-become infamous Benedict Arnold, stopped in Newburyport on their way north towards a looming battle against the, it should be British, in Quebec. After marching into the Old South Church with colours flying and drums beating, they listened to a rousing sermon from their chaplain before descending to Whitfield's crypt that lay immediately beneath them. Fearing the journey ahead through the untrodden, mysterious wilderness of what would eventually become the state of Maine, not to mention the armed conflict that awaited them in Canada, the soldiers induced the sexton to take off the lid of the coffin, removed Whitfield's clerical collar and wristbands, and proceeded to cut them up in little pieces. These keepsakes of the sainted sleeper were then divided amongst themselves as virtual talismans, disappointingly ineffective as it turns out, since they came off second best to the British shortly thereafter. While from this distance we cannot divine the actual thoughts of the men present in the vault, their collective gesture may suggest a belief or superstition about relics, in effect communicating, if the spirit of Whitfield, patron saint of the American colonies, is for us, then who can be against us? In the years that followed, devotees and trophy hunters would remove more than Whitfield's clothing. In the mid-1820s, a large bone from his right arm found its way into the possession of a Congregational minister in England. It was eventually restored to Whitfield's crypt in 1849. Meanwhile, a fragment of his thumb still sits in the Methodist archives at Drew University in Madison, New Jersey, while one of his ribs is held in the Harvard Medical School. Even if we seek to interpret this fascination with Whitfield's remains within its own cultural milieu, not as a continuation of Catholic practice, and instead as a form of 19th century Christian antiquarianism, one cannot help but imagine Whitfield, or what remains of him, rolling over in his thankfully now sealed over grave. And yet, if assessments of Whitfield's legacy have often focused on his reputation for famously effective and effective evangelistic preaching, then his ecclesiological impulses have arguably left just as significant an influence upon subsequent generations of evangelicals. As a movement theologically rooted in classical Christian orthodoxy and shaped by a largely Protestant understanding of the gospel, evangelicalism's uniqueness, suggests Doug Sweeney, lies in ecclesiological intuitions shaped by the revivals of the so-called Great Awakening. As we shall see, in several crucial ways, Whitfield embodied and cultivated many of these distinctive practices that continue to find expression amongst professing evangelicals. These especially include his evangelistic entrepreneurialism, his willingness to embrace an evangelical ecumenicity that transcended national and denominational boundaries, and his helping to normalise, wittingly or otherwise, evangelicalism's fondness for parachurch ministries and celebrity preachers. As the preeminent evangelist of the transatlantic revivals, much of Whitfield's legacy is based upon the phenomenal scope of his itinerant preaching ministry. He placed a premium on mobility, chafing against geographic provincialism and denominational parochialism. In the process, he established a model for future generations of evangelicals to seek tangible unity with Christians from different denominations and regions, privileging matters of first importance over secondary theological concerns. Whitfield, the entrepreneurial evangelist. Whitfield might have been an evangelist, but he was not simply an evangelist. He was also an expert marketer of the gospel in the new open spaces of British imperial commerce. One of the most distinctive legacies of Whitfield's preaching ministry was his breathtaking entrepreneurial spirit, especially his willingness to utilise innovative strategies to advance the gospel that he borrowed from a quickly evolving commercial marketplace. A tablet at St Mary de Crypt in Gloucester, the Church of Whitfield's youth, where he also preached his first sermon, memorialises him not simply as the Prince of Preachers, but also as a pioneer in evangelism. As an entrepreneurial evangelist, Whitfield blazed a trail for future generations of evangelicals in modelling the benefits to be had from exploiting new forms of mass communication in an emerging consumer culture to reach as wide an audience as possible. His ministry coincided with the emergence of a transatlantic print culture, especially the rise of British magazines and newspapers, media used by Christians to advance the cause of revival and inform interested parties about God's work around the world. To borrow Wordsworth's phrase, bliss it was in that dawn to be alive. And Whitfield made sure he capitalised on this blossoming promotional highway. He pioneered evangelicals' masterful use of media and not only utilised his newspaper, The Weekly History, to communicate news of revival, but also encouraged others to create their own publications, including Thomas Prince's Christian History and James Robe's Christian Monthly History. With their transatlantic coverage, newspapers provided readers with a sense of identity that transcended their own national and denominational ties. These periodicals not only supplied a commercial means for advanced publicity, they also showcased Whitfield's early awareness that even negative publicity in the press could be harnessed in the interests of revival. In late 1739, he wrote, "I've found the advantage of the things my adversaries have inserted in the public papers. They do but excite people's curiosity and serve to raise their attention, while men of seriousness and candour naturally infer that some good must be doing where such stories and falsities are invented." His preach and print strategy extended beyond newspapers to include the publication of his sermons and journals. Vast numbers of people could lay claim to having heard him preach, but by printing his sermons, Whitfield dramatically expanded the evangelistic scope of his ministry. For those who bought them, it represented an opportunity to participate in the revivals when there was no chance to hear him preach. Indeed, some people knew Whitfield only through his publications. As for his journals, he serialised their publication and in the process astutely not only made purchasing easier, but also created a heightened sense of anticipation as readers followed the evangelist's progress toward their own communities. All told, if Wesley left a greater organisational legacy and Edwards a more significant theological contribution, the entrepreneurial evangelist Whitfield was the key figure in the first generation of evangelical Christianity. Of the three, he linked by far the most pastors and leaders through his relentless travels, preaching, publishing, and letter writing networks. Whitfield, the pragmatic evangelical ecumenist. And yet, Whitfield did not simply introduce a spirit of entrepreneurialism into the practice of evangelism. He was also willing to transcend traditional denominational boundaries. The flexibility with respect to church forms and inherited religious traditions that he pioneered in the 18th century have henceforth always been important characteristics of evangelical movements. Whitfield's evangelical ecumenism expressed itself in a variety of ways, ranging from his distinctly pragmatic ecclesiology to his far more principled theology. When it came to his theology, Whitfield held his Calvinistic convictions tightly. As an ordained priest in the Church of England, he regularly appealed to the 39 Articles to defend and commend this theological stream within the evangelical family. Throughout his ministry, he was adept at establishing and nurturing ministry connections with theologically like-minded evangelicals across the transatlantic world. Indeed, the critical importance of George Whitfield for the early history of evangelicalism is suggested by the fact that he was the only major figure as completely at home in a Calvinist internationale that comprised Welsh Anglicans like William Williams, Scottish Presbyterians like Ralph and Ebenezer Erskine, and New England Congregationalists like Jonathan Edwards, as he was among the Church of England revivalists. By comparison, Whitfield's approach towards ecclesiology was decidedly more pragmatic. He viewed ecclesiastical governance structures primarily as means to evangelistic and disciple-making ends and evaluated their usefulness accordingly. Lamenting the way Christ's seamless coat should be rent in pieces on account of things in themselves purely indifferent, Whitfield's legacy for future evangelicals included a laudable emphasis on matters of first importance, but often in such a way as to render ecclesiological convictions a matter of very little importance, other than as a help or hindrance to evangelism. If he never disinherited his Church of England affiliation, he nonetheless often declared that a Catholic spirit is best, small c, Catholic. In practice, this meant presenting himself first and foremost as an interdenominational evangelist, embodying in his person and wide-ranging relationships the early evangelical movement's character as a geographically, theologically, and denominationally diverse unity, an ecclesial coalition comprising a tradition of traditions. These ecumenical intuitions began to solidify around the same time he committed himself to itinerant field preaching. As a budding ecclesiological role model for evangelicals to come, Whitfield had role models of his own, and none more influential than Howell Harris. The Welshman's evangelical ecumenicity, and not just his pioneering itinerant ministry, left a profound impact on the impressionable Whitfield. Reflecting on Harris's ministry in 1739, Whitfield commented, he is of a most Catholic spirit, aspiring to follow not just in his itinerant, but also his interdenominational footsteps. Whitfield approvingly observed the way in Harris's ministry the partition wall of bigotry and party zeal is broken down, and ministers and teachers of different communions join with one heart and one mind to carry on the kingdom of Jesus Christ. He continued, "The Lord make all the Christian world thus minded, for till this is done, I fear we must despair of any great reformation in the Church of God." It would be not long before Whitfield had the opportunity to personally enact something of the Catholicity he had admired in Harris's ministry. On April 18, 1739, he wrote that almost every day persons of all denominations come unto me, telling how they intercede in my behalf, and it shall now be my particular business, wherever I go, to bring all the children of God, notwithstanding their denominational differences, to rejoice together. Having begun to enact this pan-evangelical vision at home, his thoughts began to turn to America's eastern seaboard and its untapped opportunities for his growing ministry brand. As he settled on an itinerary for his upcoming preaching tour, Philadelphia, with its policy of religious toleration and heterogeneous population, was a propitious first port of call for Whitfield to introduce himself to the colonies. Evangelical theological soundness, rather than denominational adherence, was his functional criterion for entering into ministry partnerships. Less than a month into his precedent establishing tour, he rejoiced with a theologically like-minded Presbyterian minister at the way the evangelical doctrinal unity they shared overcame whatever denominational differences threatened to keep them apart. Quote, "Blessed be God that his love is so far shed abroad in our hearts as to cause us to love one another, though we little though we a little differ as to externals. For my part, I hate to mention them. My one sole question is, are you a Christian? At every opportunity, Whitefield cast himself as an interdenominational evangelical, refusing to be preempted by local concerns and interests, whether Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, or New World separatist. Whitefield wore his Anglican affiliation lightly, advocating for an evangelical flavoured ecumenism on the basis that, in his experience, no one denomination had a monopoly on the new birth. He contended, I saw regenerate souls among the Baptists, among the Presbyterians, among the Independents, and among the church folks, all children of God, and yet all born in a different way of worship, before metaphorically tossing his ecclesiological hands in the air and concluding, who can tell which is the most evangelical? In fact, whether one was an admirer or a detractor of the breadth of Whitefield's ministry, it was impossible to ignore the way he rejected captivity to any single denomination. He faced criticism for his ecumenism on diverse fronts. For example, the South Carolina Gazette made much of his intentional Catholicity, but interpreted it as part of a cynical project to financially exploit his audiences. The June 18, 1741 edition pejoratively cast Whitefield as a staunch churchman in Old England, a thorough independent in New England, an Anabaptist among Anabaptists, a true blue Kirkman in Scotland, and a Quaker among Quakers, becoming all things to all men, not that he might gain some, but make some gain of all. At the same time as the motivations for his Catholicity were being slandered in the American South, Whitefield's promising ministry alliance with Scottish Presbyterians, Ralph and Ebenezer Erskine, was rapidly foundering because of his unwillingness to renounce his Church of England ordination, align himself exclusively with the Scottish seceders, and forego preaching in all but associate presbytery pulpits, quickly recognising that acceding to their demand threatened to drastically curtail the scope and very essence of his interdenominational ministry. Whitefield pleaded for ecclesiological forbearance in the interests of a higher evangelistic good. Quote, I come only as an occasional preacher to preach the simple gospel to all that are willing to hear me of whatever denomination, he wrote to Ebenezer Erskine. Despite the strong Calvinistic alignment he shared with the Erskines, he contended that it will be wrong in me to join in a reformation as to church government any further than I have light given from above. While his relationship with the Erskines survived the encounter bruised but intact, an irreparable breach emerged between Whitefield and the wider associate presbytery. He openly admitted that he had not given any consideration to the intricacies, let alone the worthiness, of the Scottish seceders' cause on the grounds that he had been too busy about matters of greater importance. Unsurprisingly, it appears some Scots interpreted this cavalier dismissal of their cherished distinctives as evidence of ecclesiological heresy. In fact, Edinburgh minister Adam Gibb felt so provoked as to label him one of those false Christs of whom the church is forewarned. If anything, efforts to limit the scope of his ministry only seemed to strengthen his resolve to maintain an interdenominational course that would leave such a lasting impression on the evangelical movement. At a meeting with the Associate Presbytery in Edinburgh in August 1741, one that quickly seems to have taken on the flavour of an ecclesiastical trial, Whitefield doubled down on his pan-evangelical sensibilities, defiantly declaring, presumably to the horror of many of the staunch Scottish separatists in attendance, that even if the Pope himself would lend me his pulpit, he would gladly proclaim the righteousness of Jesus Christ therein. Almost 3 decades later, as he prepared to embark on his 7th and final preaching tour of the American colonies, Whitefield's evangelical ecumenism had not diminished in the slightest. In a parting sermon delivered on August 30, 1769, the last he would ever deliver in England, Whitefield reaffirmed the evangelical Catholicity that had been a consistent feature of his ministry. Preaching from his chosen text, John 10, he observed, "It is very remarkable. There are but 2 sorts of people. Christ does not say, 'Are you an Independent or Baptist or Presbyterian? Or are you a Church of England man?' Nor did he ask, 'Are you a Methodist?' All these things are of our own silly invention. But the whole world the Lord divides into two classes of people, sheep and goats. And then lastly, Whitefield, the trans-denominational parachurch celebrity. Delivered at London's Moorfields, the location affords an insight into a further dimension to Whitefield's evangelical ecumenicity. Not simply the interdenominational nature of his ministry, but its trans-denominational qualities. In practice, he was willing to bypass denominational structures altogether and appeal directly to individuals in the extra-ecclesial setting of massed outdoor gatherings, or in this instance, his standing room only tabernacle, which despite its considerable size left many hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous itinerant on that late summer morning, disappointed on account of the place being filled so soon. Indeed, throughout his ministry, Whitefield personally helped establish and cultivate two of evangelicalism's signature characteristics: a fondness for parachurch ministries and celebrity preachers. Before his innovative ministry, aspiring religious leaders and reformers could think of nothing grander than reviving their own denominations and convincing those in other denominations of the errors of their ways, suggests Stout. By contrast, only Whitefield thought to transcend denominational lines entirely and, in effect, ply a religious trade in the open air of the marketplace. In this way, Whitefield was not only energetic in establishing interdenominational connections with theological kindred spirits from a range of Protestant backgrounds, he was also instrumental in pioneering the creation of a trans-denominational, transatlantic parachurch community. While his ecclesial innovation was celebrated by admirers who saw in Whitefield's ministry a return to apostolical times, others viewed him as a self-promoting ecclesial law unto himself. For example, Adam Gibb, same Adam Gibb as had a go at him earlier, censured Whitefield for engaging in a parachurch ministry that to all intents lacked any external accountability. He took exception to the way Whitefield goes through the world preaching as some notable person or as a general quickener of ministers and people while standing coordinate with none of them. Gibbs suspected that when the dust settled on his preaching events that had set the world a-wondering after him, little would be left but a throng of individuals unconnected with and independent upon one another. Gibb also charged him with being motivated by self-aggrandisement, contending that the general scope of his journals is to publish and celebrate himself. He was neither the first nor the last to level accusations of this sort. Whitefield appears to have had an ambiguous attitude towards the fame that attended his ministry. On the one hand, he habitually espoused a self-effacing humility, an overwhelming sense of his unworthiness that on the face value was utterly sincere. Quite possibly the last letter he wrote was signed less than the least of all, George Whitefield. On the other hand, few great people, suggests Stout, achieve fame without aspiring to it, and Whitefield was no exception. Whether he actively sought out fame or it found him, the level of stardom he attained throughout his ministry prefigured evangelicalism's habit of elevating and feting superstar ministers and evangelists. For all of their differences, D.L. Moody, Billy Graham, not to mention the plethora of modern-day platformed evangelical influences, can trace their ministry lineage back to Whitefield as the original trans-denominational parachurch celebrity. That's just an excerpt from my reflections on Whitefield's legacy for evangelicalism. Maybe we can pair up again, Tim, for 5 minutes or so. In what ways do we see these impulses replicated in contemporary evangelical practice within the FCC, maybe even within your own pastoral setting? Why don't we take 5 or 6 minutes. Yep. Yep. interrupt your musings. So again, we've just broadened the aperture here, thinking about another lesson from the past, but in this case, an evangelical founding father, and one who has left, I think, quite a profound legacy, whether we recognise it or not, upon us in terms of his entrepreneurialism, his pragmatism, especially when it comes to ecclesiology, his focus on trans-denominationalism, parachurch ministries, and just enshrining this culture of celebrity preacherism. Things that we have inherited in many ways. His fingerprints are there on contemporary evangelicalism. At least that's my suspicion. What do you guys think? Reflections from your own context?
And at the time, I mean, there had been momentum being built through things like the Jesus March, Toronto Blessing so-called. There seemed to me at the time, there was a lot of trans-denominational cooperation because we were all aiming towards the year 2000. I went back to Canada in 98. When I returned in 2004, it's like all that disappeared. Again, it's only from my perspective, my experience. No one was talking about that. And being in ministry, even in Australia since 2004, when I gather with other Christian leaders, most of the talk seems to be about what's different, which is unfortunate. So I'm totally on his side. But I see it disappearing, and it grieves me. That's not a question, that's more of a statement, sorry.
Yeah, so certainly much to be thankful for in terms of his, so just thinking back to our first half of our discussion, so heavy emphasis on interdependence and the unity that we share in Christ. So lots to be thankful for, maybe at the expense of a principled set of ecclesiological convictions that sees ecclesiology as more than simply just a means to an end, means to an evangelistic or disciple-making end. But certainly lots to be thankful for.
Well, it's like our ecclesiological distinctives become the gospel. You know, that we'll promote Jesus and congregational governance. What are the other models called? Sorry. Episcopal governance, you know, and so it's like you have to believe that and that gets in the way. I would prefer we were committed to sharing the gospel, and I do that, but I'm a Congregationalist. You're a Catholic, and that's fine, but we're committed to spreading the kingdom. Anyway. I'm grandstanding now. Let me give someone else a chance.
I feel like I'm dominating the conversation, sorry. But I was reflecting on other things, like more culturally. So we would be, I think in what many would say is a post-denominational space. And I'll pick on my father, for example, who some of us know. He didn't go for church for a number of years, but he would still identify himself as a passionate Congregationalist, right? And that's of his generation, whereas people in my generation, and I saw this at SMBC when I was there, aren't really denominationally inclined. And I don't know if they'd trace that to Whitfield as much as it's a reflection of kind of Western modern society.
Yeah.
In some ways. Some ways, there are different things. I went to an Acts 29 conference recently where there's a lot of Queensland Baptists. And but they were minimally Baptist. It was just a structure that they happened to be in.
Yes.
They're much more passionate about Acts 29 movement.
Yes.
So again, I don't know if that agree.
A parachurch
100%.
entity. Yeah.
And the celebrity preachers, the big name preachers, massive churches in the US, blah 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 blah. Churches who want to do the same thing here. Is that right or wrong? I'm not sure. But yeah, again, I don't know if that echoes or challenges some of the things. I mean, it's really interesting to think about. And as someone who is in a leadership, quote unquote, role within the fellowship, I had to do some serious thinking about that. What's the future of even a smaller network like the Fellowship within that cultural milieu.
Yeah.
Again, I don't have any answers. It's just an interesting thing to sort of throw out. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
The reflections.
Since no one else is talking, I'll just say one other thing. Sorry?
Yeah, keep going.
Just one slight other, again, like you use Whitfield as an example of a celebrity preacher. I wonder how compared to someone like Wesley was mentioned, who was, I guess the example I was thinking of was Spurgeon, who, as far as I know, was a local church pastor, still a celebrity. I think he was a Baptist, if I'm right in that. But stayed in the same church his whole ministry. Right. So, like a celebrity, his stuff was publicised. I just wonder how that compares to someone like Whitfield. I was thinking that in my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So think of even more contemporary examples of, a Piper or a Keller in multi-site congregations.
Yeah.
So it certainly didn't cease with a Spurgeon.
Yeah, for sure.
But yes, it's not just limited to those engaged in itinerant ministry.
Yes,
It can manifest itself in
Yeah.
local church ministries where ministry brand can be promoted through different technologies that are available to us today that weren't to Whitfield. So just promotion through the internet today, being the venue through which celebrity is achieved.
Yeah, for sure.
Who'd be a local church pastor in that context where you're having to compete against these in that context?
For sure.
Just one reflection for myself, which is that, when does ecclesiological distinctives and methods just become solely about pragmatism, as in, well, this is what works for this context, and this is what works here, and when is there actually an underlying spiritual or doctrinal part to that? Because then the question about interdependency might be, who are the churches that I'm spiritually aligned with that I see as brothers and sisters in Christ, and therefore I have a certain way of acting to them, versus, well, who's going to be the group that I'm going to network with that is going to help me move the gospel forward? And even if that means, as Whitfield sort of said, the Pope offers me, I'm ready to, I'll sign on the dotted line because, this gives the gospel opportunities and things as well.
He's an interesting... he's quite conflicted in one sense. Like, so yes, happy to use a Catholic pulpit nominally, if that's what it would take, and yet quite principled theologically as well. So almost dismissing in a quite cavalier fashion ecclesiological differences. The main thing is the gospel, and particularly a Calvinistic expression of the gospel. So it explains why he had such difficulties relating to an Arminian evangelical like Wesley, where, they achieved a sort of reunion as time went on, but for a while things were pretty fractious there. Even though they shared ostensibly the same ecclesiological convictions, the main thing for him was a theological conviction around the gospel and a particular expression, Calvinistic expression of the gospel as well.
I think on that note, there's something also rich to be engaged with people who don't necessarily think the same way as ourselves.
Yes.
Because then we don't come with the, well, I've arrived, I've got all my things solidified, I understand how this all works.
Yeah.
One of the amazing and beautiful things about Wesley is that John Owen, as a Congregationalist and a significant figure theologically, was virtually unknown in his own day. And it wasn't until sort of Wesley rediscovered his writings that it was sort of brought out. So there's Wesley in some ways influenced by that relationship with Whitefield, and Whitefield also saying there's aspects about the proclamation of the gospel that means I can work alongside a brother like Wesley, who I genuinely see as someone who I'm going to one day be standing in glory with.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, fantastic. Good. Any last comments, reflections? $25, guys. If you don't have cash, no worries. We can work something out. I have a few copies.
Thanks so much, Ian, for sharing.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
For those of us who are able, may not be everyone, that's fine. But a few of us are going to go get some lunch. I assume Michael down in Breezy or Pastor or something pretty close by. We can carpool or organise that together. Again, no obligation. Some of you may have to go, which is fine. But it'd be great if you could join us. In terms of a few housekeeping bits and pieces, I probably should have said this at the start. There's a bathroom a bit of wide way through there. If you're busting, yeah, sort of through there and around a bit. But Michael can point that out. Also, in terms of things coming up, we have some plans. We did have a session locked in for the 26th of April. Unfortunately, the guy we had sort of penciled in, he's had some health challenges. I'm still trying to figure out if he can help out or not. There may have to be some changes there. Yeah. 26th of Sunday. Oh, is it really? We'll have to check that. Maybe you're right. Yeah. I'll flick out an email. It's in April, kind of late April. I'll have to check my dates there. Thanks, Alan. I think that's right. You are right. Yes, you are 100% right. And I must have put the wrong date there. Anyway, we have a session planned for late April. I'll send out an email the next week when I know more. As I said, I had someone penciled in for that, but he's had some health challenges, so we may need to pivot. But it's likely to be online. But I'll communicate information. Someone from the team will communicate some information about that in the next week or so. So bear with us on that as well. In terms of now, I think I might get James. Would you mind praying for us, and then we can go our separate ways.
Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for this morning. We thank you for all those who could join both in person and online. Thank you for the stimulating time that we've had, and thank you for Ian's contribution, helping us to think through what it is to be congregational, our history and our distinctives. And we pray that you would continue to give us wisdom as we reflect on what we've heard this